In February 2025, Microsoft stood on a stage and made one of the boldest claims in the history of quantum computing. After more than 2 decades of research, billions of dollars in investment, and years of skepticism from both competitors and scientists, the company announced what it called the world's first practical topological quantum chip. The chip was named Majorana at the time. Many people saw it as an interesting scientific milestone. Others dismissed it as another quantum headline that would take decades to matter. Then something unexpected happened. Just 1 year later, Microsoft came back with a second announcement. And this time, the numbers were so dramatic that even longtime skeptics had to stop and pay attention. According to Microsoft, the new generation of its quantum technology improved qubit stability by more than 1,000 times in a single year. 1,000 times. To put that into perspective, improvements of that magnitude are not supposed to happen in mature scientific fields. In most advanced technologies, researchers celebrate gains of 10%, sometimes 20%. 1,000-fold improvement is the kind of number that forces people to ask whether the entire timeline has just changed. Because if Microsoft's claims hold up, the race toward practical quantum computers may no longer be measured in decades. It may be measured in years. And the most surprising part is that this breakthrough didn't come from building a bigger machine, a colder laboratory, or a more powerful computer. It came from changing the material at the heart of the chip itself. Today, we're going to unpack exactly what Microsoft built, why some scientists are calling it one of the most important quantum breakthroughs in years, why others remain cautious, and why a single material change may have just accelerated the future of computing faster than almost anyone expected. Let's get into it. For most of us, quantum computing feels like one of those technologies that permanently lives 5 or 10 years in the future. Every few months, there's a new headline, a new breakthrough, a new company claiming it has solved a problem that experts previously thought would take decades. Then the excitement fades, reality returns, and the future remains exactly where it was before. And that's why what Microsoft announced recently is so unusual, because this story isn't really about making a quantum computer faster, it's about making one survive. And strangely enough, survival has always been the real problem. To understand why Microsoft's latest announcement matters, you first need to understand the fundamental challenge that has haunted quantum computing since the very beginning. A classical computer stores information using bits. Each bit exists as either a 0 or a 1. Everything your laptop does, every video you watch, every message you send ultimately comes down to billions of tiny switches flipping between those two states. Quantum computers work differently. Instead of bits, they use qubits, and unlike classical bits, qubits can exist in combinations of both 0 and 1 at the same time through a phenomenon known as superposition. That single property is what makes quantum computing so powerful. And certain calculations that would take traditional supercomputers thousands or even millions of years could theoretically be completed by a large enough quantum computer in a matter of hours. Drug discovery, advanced materials, climate simulations, cryptography, artificial intelligence. Entire industries could be transformed. The potential is so enormous that governments and corporations have poured tens of billions of dollars into the race. But there's always been one brutal catch. Qubits are unbelievably fragile. And when I say fragile, I don't mean delicate in the way a smartphone screen is delicate. I mean fragile in a way that almost feels absurd. A tiny vibration can interfere with them. A stray electromagnetic signal can interfere with them. Heat can interfere with them. Cosmic radiation can interfere with them. Sometimes simply existing inside the physical universe seems enough to interfere with them. Researchers spend enormous amounts of effort trying to protect quantum states from the outside world. Because the moment a qubit interacts with its environment, it risks losing the very quantum properties that make it useful. This process is called decoherence. And decoherence is essentially the villain in every quantum computing story. Imagine trying to write a novel while someone repeatedly erases random words from the page. You might manage a few sentences, maybe even a few paragraphs, but eventually the information becomes corrupted faster than you can create it. That's what happens inside quantum systems. The computation starts. The qubits begin doing something extraordinary. Then reality interrupts. The quantum state collapses, and the calculation fails. For decades, quantum researchers have been fighting that problem. Different companies chose different approaches. Some focused on superconducting qubits, others pursued trapped ions, others explored photonic systems. Each platform came with strengths and weaknesses. Each achieved impressive results, but every approach shared the same fundamental challenge: keeping quantum information alive long enough to do useful work. And this is where Microsoft's story begins to diverge from everyone else's, because while most of the industry focused on protecting fragile qubits after they were created, Microsoft spent years asking a different question. What if the qubit itself could be fundamentally harder to break? It's a subtle distinction, but an incredibly important one. Instead of constantly defending quantum information from the outside world, what if you could build quantum information into a structure that naturally resisted disruption? And that's the idea that led Microsoft down one of the most controversial paths in modern physics. A path centered around something called a topological qubit. Now, before your eyes glaze over at the word topological, stay with me, because this concept is actually easier to understand than it sounds. Imagine writing information on a piece of paper. If someone smudges one corner, the information might be lost. Now imagine that same information spread across an entire giant mural. Damaging one small section doesn't destroy the message because the information isn't concentrated in one place. It's distributed across the whole structure. That's essentially the promise of topological quantum computing. Instead of storing quantum information in a single fragile location, you encode it into the broader geometry and structure of the system itself. The information becomes harder to disturb because it isn't tied to any one point. Nature has to work much harder to destroy it, at least in theory. The challenge was that nobody had successfully built one. For years, topological quantum computing existed somewhere between brilliant idea and impossible engineering projects. Scientists believed it could work, mathematicians loved the theory, and physicists spent years searching for evidence, but actually turning the concept into functioning hardware proved extraordinarily difficult. In fact, the journey became so difficult that some researchers began wondering whether the entire approach was a dead end. Microsoft didn't stop. The company continued investing billions of dollars and some of the world's best physicists into the problem. Year after year, paper after paper, experiment after experiment. And if you've been following this story for a while, you know it wasn't always smooth. And there were controversies, scientific disagreements, published results that later faced criticism, claims that sparked intense debate throughout the physics community. At times, it genuinely seemed possible that Microsoft's approach might never work. If you've been following quantum computing for years, I'd actually love to know your perspective. Were you someone who believed Microsoft's topological approach would eventually pay off, or were you skeptical? Leave a comment, because this has been one of the most debated topics in quantum research for a long time, and it's fascinating to see how differently people viewed the same journey. Then came Majorana, named after the mysterious Majorana particles that inspired the architecture. Microsoft's first chip represented the culmination of more than 20 years of effort. For the first time, the company demonstrated a working topological qubit platform built around specially engineered materials. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it showed that the concept was real, and that's where things started becoming interesting. Because once the foundation existed, Microsoft could begin improving it. And the first generation already demonstrated something remarkable. But there was still a major problem. The qubits weren't surviving nearly long enough. Errors still occurred. Quantum states still collapsed. Useful large-scale quantum computation remained out of reach. The architecture had proven itself. Now the company needed to prove it could scale, and that challenge led directly to the breakthrough that would eventually generate headlines around the world. What Microsoft discovered was that one of the biggest remaining obstacles wasn't the architecture itself. It was the material being used to build it. Sometimes technological revolutions don't happen because someone invents an entirely new idea. Sometimes they happen because someone finds a better material, a stronger material, a cleaner material, a material that unlocks performance everyone knew was theoretically possible but couldn't quite reach. And that's exactly where the story takes a dramatic turn. Because the change Microsoft made sounds almost simple when you first hear it, but the consequences may end up reshaping the entire future of quantum computing. The material Microsoft chose for its first-generation Majorana chip was aluminum, and that decision made perfect sense at the time. Aluminum is one of the most well-understood superconducting materials on Earth. Engineers know how it behaves. They know how to manufacture it. They know how to integrate it into semiconductor fabrication systems. If you're building something completely new and extraordinarily complicated, starting with a familiar material is usually the safest choice. But safe and optimal are not always the same thing. The problem was that aluminum had limits. Deep inside every superconducting quantum system exists an invisible battle between order and disruption. The entire goal is to keep electrons paired together in stable quantum states for as long as possible. The moment those pairs break apart, errors begin creeping into the system. Think of it like trying to keep thousands of perfectly synchronized dancers moving together across a stage. The larger and more coordinated the performance becomes, the more damaging even a single disruption can be. One dancer falls out of rhythm, then another dot, and then another, and before long, the performance collapses. Quantum systems behave in surprisingly similar ways. The quantum information isn't lost because of one dramatic event. It's lost because countless tiny disturbances gradually chip away at stability. Microsoft realized that if they wanted dramatically longer-lived qubits, they needed a material capable of resisting those disturbances much more effectively. That's when they turned to something unexpected. Lead, not a new exotic material discovered in a laboratory. Not a revolutionary substance invented through artificial intelligence, plain old lead, the same element humans have known about for thousands of years. Yet under the extreme conditions inside a quantum computer, lead offered something aluminum could not. A significantly larger superconducting energy gap. Without getting buried in physics equations, you can think of this energy gap as a protective barrier. The larger the barrier, the harder it becomes for unwanted energy from the environment to break apart the fragile quantum states inside the system. Imagine trying to protect a castle. A taller wall doesn't make attacks impossible, but it dramatically reduces how often attackers successfully get through, and that's essentially what Microsoft built. A much taller wall around its quantum information. The results were extraordinary. According to Microsoft, qubit lifetimes that previously lasted only milliseconds suddenly extended into tens of seconds. And some devices reportedly survived even longer. And while seconds may not sound impressive in everyday life, in quantum computing, it's a completely different story. A few extra milliseconds can change everything. A few extra seconds can change an entire industry because quantum operations happen incredibly fast. A quantum gate operation may take only microseconds. That means a qubit surviving for 20 seconds isn't just surviving a little longer. It's surviving millions upon millions of computational steps for years. One of the biggest criticisms facing quantum computing was that error rates were overwhelming progress. Researchers spent enormous effort correcting mistakes instead of performing useful calculations. But if Microsoft's architecture truly reduces errors at the rate they're claiming, the conversation changes. Suddenly, the bottleneck may no longer be coherence time. Suddenly, other challenges become more important, and that's why so many people paid attention to this announcement, not because Microsoft built a perfect quantum computer. They didn't. Not even close, but because they may have removed one of the largest obstacles standing in the way. Now, before we get carried away, it's important to talk about the skepticism, because science advances through evidence, not excitement. And quantum computing has seen enough hype over the years to make researchers naturally cautious. Some physicists have pointed out that long qubit lifetimes alone don't prove a fully functional quantum computer. And they're right. A qubit surviving for 20 seconds is impressive. But can it be controlled precisely? Can it perform reliable quantum gates? Can it execute meaningful algorithms? Can thousands of these qubits operate together simultaneously? Those questions remain critically important. A race car engine might survive for days without failing. That doesn't automatically mean the car can win a race. The entire system matters, and many researchers want more evidence before declaring Microsoft's approach the future of quantum computing. And that's a reasonable position. In fact, it's probably the healthy position. Extraordinary claims deserve extraordinary scrutiny. Microsoft appears confident that additional results will address those concerns. The company says further demonstrations of control, operations, and algorithm execution are coming. If those demonstrations prove successful, the significance of this breakthrough could become even larger. If they don't, the skepticism will grow. That's simply how science works. And honestly, that's one of the things I appreciate most about stories like this. The outcome isn't predetermined. We're watching it unfold. We're watching it unfold in real time. Nobody knows exactly how this ends. Not Microsoft, not its competitors, not the experts commenting online. The future is still being written. If you enjoy following these technology races as they happen, this might be a good moment to subscribe. Not because of some algorithm or marketing strategy, but because the most fascinating part of these stories is rarely the headline itself. It's watching what happens next. The breakthroughs, the setbacks, the surprises nobody predicted, and it's genuinely enjoyable having a community of people who are curious enough to follow those journeys together. What's particularly interesting is how quickly the timeline now appears to be changing. Just a few years ago, many experts believed useful quantum computers were still decades away. Then algorithms improved, error correction improved, hardware improved. And now Microsoft's latest results suggest qubit stability may be improving much faster than many expected. The target is moving from both directions. The hardware is getting better. The software requirements are becoming more efficient, and the gap between today's capabilities and tomorrow's applications is shrinking. Whether Microsoft's projected timeline proves accurate remains to be seen. Personally, I wouldn't bet my life savings on any specific year. Technology has a habit of surprising us. Sometimes progress arrives faster than expected, and sometimes it takes much longer. But one thing feels increasingly difficult to deny. Quantum computing no longer feels like science fiction. It feels like engineering, and that's a very important distinction. Science fiction asks whether something is possible. Engineering asks how quickly it can be built. That's a completely different conversation, and perhaps that's the biggest takeaway from Microsoft's announcement. The company didn't simply demonstrate a better quantum chip. It demonstrated a path, a believable path, a roadmap that appears more concrete than it did a year ago. Will that roadmap lead directly to practical quantum computers? Maybe. Will unexpected obstacles emerge? Almost certainly Every major technological revolution encounters surprises. But when you zoom out and look at the broader picture, something remarkable is happening. After decades of theory, decades of experiments, decades of false starts and cautious optimism, quantum computing is finally beginning to accumulate breakthroughs faster than it accumulates excuses. That's worth paying attention to. Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your honest opinion. Do you think practical quantum computers arrive within the next decade, or do you believe we're still much further away than companies like Microsoft suggest? There's a genuine debate here, and reasonable people can disagree. Share your thoughts in the comments, because these discussions are often just as interesting as the technology itself. And if you've made it all the way to the end, thank you. Seriously, there are countless things competing for your attention today, and the fact that you spent time exploring one of the most complicated technologies humans have ever attempted to build means a lot. Because whether Microsoft's timeline proves exactly right or not, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The quantum future isn't getting further away. For the first time in a long time, it feels like it's getting closer.